Humanity's need to push farther every year has made great strides within the past 2 centuries. The result has been a rapid increase in standard of living and technological advancement. These efforts have been retarded since the consideration of public health and safety have come into effect. Due to these considered regulations in most advanced first world countries, manufacturing facilities have been built in less advanced and/or less healthy. The incident at Morales began with a newly hired and experienced engineer, Fred. The company he now worked for, Faust, was a chemical company responsible for the manufacturing of commercial-grade paint stripper. Fred was familiar with the standards and procedures involved with the design of the facility requested by Faust. However, this new plant was to be constructed in Morales, Mexico, in an effort to reduce production cost. Faust eventually passed information to Fred that the budget and schedule had been cut. Now working with a new budget cut of 20%, Fred needed to make dramatic changes by compromising safety and production costs. Management was ever present in the overseeing of this construction and cost consideration. The ethical issues of company/employer loyalty, health and safety considerations are the biggest issues Fred faced as he attempted to raise flags on different issues. Fred was forced to compromise on a number of these issues for a less effective solution. Ultimately, Faust was responsible for the death of the Morales plant manager, Manuel. The incident at Morales, which involved high-level management, engineers, market pressure, budget cuts, and scheduling, was a very complex issue. Fred, the protagonist in this event, was constantly at odds with himself by the plant design regarding pollution and employee safety. He decided to use cheaper control systems and pipe valves. Leaking from the valves as a result of improper temperature and pressure regulation was observed before the event. Fred was well versed in the construction of plants and the requirements to build them efficiently as well as safely. However, Faust decided to construct his plant in Mexico, which has less strict safety and disposal regulations than the U.S. Fred knew that the byproducts of this paint stripper were toxic, and he eventually convinced management to allow better processing of the toxic byproducts in regard to the health and welfare of the public. Unfortunately, this allocation of resources had a very serious outcome. The allocation of budget toward byproduct processing took away from the use of proper control systems and pipe valves. The control systems, which were noted to be 1/100th of the normal cost, were insufficient by high temperature and pressures. The valves were observed to leak around the seams in the first few test batches of the paint stripper. Ultimately, Fred was largely responsible for the death of the plant manager, Manuel. Fred's competence was observed to decline within the confines of this event. Fred was hired due to his good work with his previous employer, and was very respected for his past performance. Fred had designed plants before, so there was nothing that he wasn't familiar with in the process. Halfway through the incident, Fred was observed to be studying Mexican law and regulation regarding safety and health compared to American regulations. It was mentioned that the regulations were insufficient for the well-being of the public. However, Fred compromised too much and showed a reduction in competence, justifying the use of cheap valves and control modules. Fred was repeatedly told that his division had the responsibility to construct the plant, but they were not responsible for it afterwards when they turned it over to Faust for operations. Wally, Fred's supervisor, told Fred that it would be the company's responsibility for the operation and maintenance, and to let them worry about the discrepancies or inefficiencies of the design. The idea of employee and employer trust is paramount for an effective work environment. This was observed to work on most levels within Faust in this incident. With the exception of Wally, who suggested that all changes should be filtered through him, management at Faust worked on a trust-based relationship in which Fred did his job to the best of his ability. Fred went as far as to alert management of insufficient regulations within the community of Morales. Fred suggested integrating parts from the plant he designed from his previous employer with the plant he was supposed to now design. Fred repeatedly said that he would not divulge company secrets about both Faust and his previous employer. Through this entire event, Fred was notably respectful, trustful, and faithful to his employers. List the ethical issues you observed in incident at Morales. Faust hiring the former design engineer that worked for Chemitol, Fred Martinez. Wally's one rule encourages dishonesty and unfairness. This rule is set in place so Wally can regulate what information and actions are taken in order to prevent anything being done that isn't within Wally's best interests. Fred is urged to use expensive and overqualified controls for the plant due to inside connections with Lutz and Lutz, a Swiss company. Fred is put into the position of deciding whether or not to line the evaporation ponds to prevent seepage of hazardous substances. The local laws don't enforce this. And Fred has to decide whether or not to purchase pipes and connectors made with stainless steel or high-pressure alloys. Fred intentionally chooses the untested material and decides that it would be cheaper to replace after a certain amount of uses. From your personal perspective, prioritize these ethical issues from most critical to least critical. Fred is urged to use expensive and overqualified controls for the plant due to inside connections with Lutz and Lutz, a Swiss company. Fred has to decide whether or not to purchase pipes and connectors made with stainless steel or high-pressure alloys. Fred intentionally chooses the most untested material and decides that it would be cheaper to replace after a certain amount of uses. Fred is put into the position of deciding whether or not to line the evaporation ponds to prevent seepage of hazardous substances. The local law does not enforce this. Wally's one rule encourages dishonesty and unfairness. This rule is set in place so Wally can regulate what information and actions are taken in order to prevent anything being done that isn't within Wally's best interests. And Faust hiring the former design engineer that worked for Chemitol, Fred Martinez. Fred's perspective. What specific ethical issues do you face? Should I use cheaper controls, knowing that I may not get adequate results? Should I take actions to evaporate the ponds to protect the safety of locals' drinking water, even if the regulations by the government do not require this? Should I purchase cheaper pipes and connectors at the risk of putting the operator in danger? What are some things that you should consider? First of all, the plant I design should not threaten the life of people who will directly use it. The plant must meet the requirements of the company without violating safety rules. Then I should make sure that the plant will not threaten the safety, health, and welfare of the public. In this case, the plant will be made by a U.S. company and built in Mexico, so should I follow this rule even if the plant would possibly do harm to the locals? From whom or where should you seek guidance? I think I should first ask some other professional engineers like Jake, or I could tell the situation to the public authorities. Wally's perspective. What specific ethical issues does Wally face? The public interest, the effects of the safety of the workers at the plant and the environment of the people that live in Morales, Mexico. Qualities of truth, honesty, and fairness. Wally's one rule discourages honesty and fairness because it limits who his subordinates can go to for issues they may face. What do you think Wally's motivation was for having one rule? He wants to know all information that gets passed so he can input his own opinion, ethical or not, to influence the information that leadership receives, and thus the decisions made based on that information. What do you think about Wally's one rule? It keeps his subordinates from being able to talk to the people that should know things. Engineers need to be able to speak to or inform whoever is responsible for that information, rather than be discouraged to be honest and share information. What decisions would you change if you were Wally? I would not have been so gung-ho on skipping the safety measures in order to meet cost requirements. Safety is of utmost importance, regardless of the price. I also would not have scolded Fred for him speaking with Chuck about his ethical concerns. It is the primary responsibility of an engineer to look out for the safety of the public. Responsibility perspective. If you were in charge and had the authority and the funding to make any changes you wanted to make in your company policies, what specific steps would you take to improve the company culture? I would start by reducing the stress load from the employee that is faced with the ethical issue and instead spread the responsibility to all employees involved. For example, Fred is forced to make a decision on multiple ethical issues. This individual stress load could be resolved through team meetings. This way, the final decision doesn't rest solely on Fred's shoulders. Who would you involve in this process? Any employees that meet the qualifications. How and when would you communicate the company policies to your employees? A personal notice immediately. Your clients? The client would be reassured that whichever decision that is made would be a decision made from multiple qualified individuals. And the public? Public relations when the topic arises. The incident at Morales was certainly a tragic one. This incident demonstrates that an engineer can be competent, trustworthy, and hardworking, but still makes mistakes. The pressure of heavy restrictions imposed by management can be very encumbering for an individual. Fred's case consisted of poor management, budget cuts, and insufficient safety and disposal regulations. These pressures resulted in the tragic death of Manuel, the plant manager. The legal responsibility is on Faust, but Fred's guilt was without question.